My name is Claire Weston and I was 33 years old, sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a building I had given 7 years of my life to, when my managing director slid a folder across the table and told me that Marcus Webb had been promoted to senior partner. Not me. Marcus Webb, who had joined the firm 2 years after me, who had spent the first 18 months of his tenure asking me questions he then repeated in meetings as his own conclusions, who had presented, 6 weeks before that conversation, a client strategy to the executive board that I recognized from the first slide because I had built it, line by line, in a document saved on my desktop under a file name with my initials and a date stamp that predated his presentation by 11 weeks. I looked at the folder. I looked at my managing director, a man named Gerald Fitch who had the specific expression of someone delivering news he finds uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to have prevented. I asked him one question. Was my work used to prepare Marcus for this role? Gerald looked at the folder. He said the firm valued collaboration and that senior leadership decisions were made holistically. I said thank you. I picked up my coffee. I walked back to my desk. And I spent the next 4 days doing something Gerald Fitch did not see coming and Marcus Webb never considered possible. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not to the conference room. Not to Marcus Webb's promotion. Further back, to the day I walked into Harlow Meridian Consulting as a 26-year-old analyst with a graduate degree in financial strategy and the specific ambition of someone who has spent her entire education preparing for a room she has never been allowed to enter. Harlow Meridian was a mid-sized strategic consulting firm with a reputation that exceeded its size, the kind of firm that punched above its weight because it had spent 20 years cherry-picking talent and then working that talent until it either quit or became indispensable. I became indispensable. That was the mistake I made, not because indispensability is wrong, but because I made myself indispensable to people who had no intention of rewarding it. I was good at the work from the beginning. Not in the way that gets noticed immediately, not the flashy kind of good that announces itself in meetings and gets credit in real time, the quieter kind, the kind that builds frameworks other people use, the kind that finds the number inside the number that changes the whole analysis, the kind that clients remember not because you performed for them but because you solved something they had stopped believing was solvable. My first major client relationship was with a regional logistics company called Harbridge. I inherited the account from a senior analyst who left the firm in my second year and I built it from a mid-tier retainer into one of Harlow Meridian's top 5 revenue-generating relationships over the next 3 years. I did this through a combination of deep sector knowledge, the specific patience required to understand a client's actual problem rather than the problem they present, and a level of responsiveness that meant Harbridge's CEO called me directly rather than going through account management. I want to tell you that I was recognized for this. I was not. I received a performance bonus that was appropriate and an annual review that used the word excellent 3 times and then explained that partnership track decisions were based on a holistic view of leadership potential. I was told to continue developing my executive presence. I was told this by a man who had never once seen me in a room where I did not have the most relevant expertise present. I said thank you. I went back to my desk. I built 3 more client relationships over the following 2 years using the same methodology. Each one started as an underperforming account and each one ended, by the time I was 31, as a flagship relationship that the firm used in its new business pitches. Marcus Webb joined Harlow Meridian in my 4th year. He was 32, an MBA from a school with a better name than mine, a background in investment banking that gave him fluency in the language of financial strategy without the depth that came from actually doing the work over time. He was charming in the specific way of people who have been rewarded for charm their entire careers and have therefore never had to develop anything underneath it. He was also, and I want to be precise about this, not incompetent. He was capable. He was just significantly less capable than the room generally assumed based on his confidence and his educational pedigree and the ease with which he occupied a space. He was given a desk 2 offices from mine and assigned to shadow several senior analysts during his onboarding. I was one of them. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next because I have thought about it for years and I understand it differently now than I did when it was happening. When Marcus shadowed my work in those first months, I did not withhold anything. I explained my methodologies. I shared my framework. I walked him through the logic of my client strategies because that is what you do when someone is learning and you are responsible for their development and you believe, at a fundamental level, that sharing knowledge is a net positive for everyone in the room. I was wrong about the last part, not as a principle, as a description of that specific room. Marcus absorbed what I shared and began deploying it in meetings, first carefully, then with increasing confidence, and then with a fluency that made it sound like his own thinking rather than thinking he had been given access to. This happened gradually enough that I almost missed it. Almost. The thing about building frameworks is that you recognize them the way you recognize your own handwriting, not because of any single characteristic holistic but because of the particular combination of choices that add up to a signature. By the end of his first year, Marcus was presenting work in meetings that had my signature on it. Not literally, figuratively, the specific combination of analytical choices that I had spent 4 years developing, dressed up in his language, delivered in his voice, received as his thinking. I raised it once, with my direct manager at the time, a woman named Sandra Park who was sharp and overworked and navigating her own set of institutional constraints. I told her what I was observing. I used careful language because I understood the room I was in. Sandra listened. She said she would keep an eye on it. 3 weeks later she left the firm for a role at a competitor and her responsibilities were absorbed by Gerald Fitt, who had never once kept an eye on anything that did not directly affect his own position. I kept working. What else do you do? I kept building client relationship. I kept developing frameworks. I kept being the person Harbridge called when they had a problem that mattered and kept being described in my annual reviews as excellent with significant leadership development potential, which in consulting language means you are valuable and we intend to keep you exactly where you are. In my 6th year, Harlow Meridian won a major new account, a national healthcare distribution company called Ventress Group, through a competitive pitch process. I was part of the pitch team. I led the analytical work. The strategy we presented was mine in the way that the strategies in my performance reviews were always mine, which is to say entirely, documented in a folder on my desktop with a timestamp that told the whole story. Ventress Group signed with Harlow Meridian 6 weeks after the pitch. The account was assigned to Marcus Webb as lead partner. I found this out in the same way I found out most things at Harlow Meridian, not in a conversation where someone told me directly but in a meeting where it was mentioned as established fact, the way you mention something everyone already knows. I sat in that meeting and I said nothing. I had learned by then that the room I was in did not reward the response I wanted to give. And I had also learned something more important. The response I wanted to give was not the most useful one available to me. That evening I went home and I opened a document on my personal laptop that I had been adding to intermittently for 8 months. Not a grievance log, a business plan. The kind you write when you have spent 6 years learning everything about an industry from the inside and have begun to understand that the thing keeping you from the work you are capable of is not your capability. The business plan was for a strategic consulting firm. Small, specific, built around the client relationships I had developed and the methodologies I had refined and the sector knowledge I had accumulated over 7 years of being the person who actually did the work. It had a name. It had a financial model. It had a client acquisition strategy that was, in retrospect, almost conservative given what actually happened. It needed one more thing before it was ready. It needed the moment to be right. Marcus's promotion gave me the moment. The morning after Gerald Fitch slid that folder across the table, I called a woman named Rita Osei. Rita was a contract attorney who specialized in employment and non-compete agreements and who had reviewed my Harlow Meridian employment contract 18 months earlier when I had first started thinking seriously about what came next. She had identified 3 things then that I had stored carefully and returned to now. The first was that my non-compete clause was narrowly drafted in a way that restricted me from working with Harlow Meridian's existing clients for 12 months but did not restrict me from approaching clients I had personally originated if those clients initiated contact with me. The second was that the intellectual property provisions in my contract applied to work produced using company resources or during company time but did not automatically capture methodologies developed on my own time using my own equipment, provided I could demonstrate the development timeline. The third was that my employment agreement included a provision for what it called constructive dismissal, meaning that if I could demonstrate the firm had materially failed to fulfill its obligations to me, I had grounds for a negotiated exit rather than a resignation. Rita had told me 18 months ago that these 3 things, taken together, gave me considerably more flexibility than most people in my position understood they had. She had also told me that the moment I decided to use them, I should call her first and not say anything to anyone at the firm until we had spoken. I called her at 8 in the morning. She answered on the second ring. I told her about Marcus. I told her about Ventress. I told her about the folder Gerald had slid across the table. She listened without interrupting. When I finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have been building toward this for 18 months. Are you ready?" I said yes. She said, "Then let us talk about how the next 4 days are going to go. Here's what those 4 days looked like." Day 1 was Tuesday. Rita drafted a formal letter documenting the constructive dismissal grounds. Not a threat, a record, a precise, dated, factual account of the specific ways in which Harlow Meridian had materially failed to fulfill its obligations, the repeated use of my work product without attribution, the Ventress account assignment, the pattern of promotion decisions that the documented performance record did not support. Rita filed it with the firm's legal counsel with a request for a meeting. Day 2 was Wednesday. I spent it doing 2 things simultaneously. At the office, I worked normally. Client calls, analysis, the same work I always did. Nobody at Harlow Meridian knew that anything was different because nothing at Harlow Meridian was different yet. Away from the office, office. In the evenings, I finalized the business plan. I incorporated the firm. I opened a business bank account. I signed a lease on a small office space that a friend had tipped me to, a clean 2-room suite in a building 4 blocks from Harlow Meridian's offices, available immediately, priced for a startup. Day 3 was Thursday. Rita had the meeting with Harlow Meridian's legal counsel. I was not in the room. I was at my desk, working. Rita called me at 4 in the afternoon. She said the firm's counsel had been receptive. She said there was an offer on the table, a negotiated exit, clean reference, no contest of the constructive dismissal claim, the non-compete waived in its entirety in exchange for a release of claims. I said yes. Day 4 was Friday. I went into the office at 8 in the morning. I sat at my desk. I cleared my personal items, which did not take long because I had been clearing them intermittently for 6 weeks. I wrote 3 emails, one to Gerald Fitch, formal and brief, one to the firm's HR department confirming the terms of the exit, and one to my assistant thanking her for 4 years of working together, which was the hardest email of the 4 days because she was genuinely good at her job and had nothing to do with any of this. I walked out of Harlow Meridian at 11:15 on a Friday morning with a box that fit in one hand and an exit agreement that waived my non-compete entirely. On Monday morning, I opened the doors of Weston Strategy Group. Have you ever made a decision that terrified you and freed you at exactly the same moment? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And subscribe so you are here for the part that Gerald Fitch did not see coming, because what happened in the first 90 days of Weston Strategy Group is something that still makes me sit back in my chair on a quiet afternoon and feel the specific satisfaction of a thing that went exactly the way it was supposed to. The first call came on Monday afternoon, 3 hours after I sent the announcement email. I had sent it to a carefully selected list, not a mass communication, not a public announcement, a personal email, written the way I wrote everything, specifically and without excess, to 43 people who had worked with me over 7 years and whose relationship with me was based on the work rather than on my institutional affiliation. The email said I had left Harlow Meridian and opened Weston Strategy Group. It described the firm's focus, which was strategic and financial consulting for mid-market companies in the logistic, healthcare distribution, and supply chain sectors, which were the 3 sectors in which I had spent 7 years developing expertise. It said I would be in touch individually over the coming week and that I was available to speak with anyone who wanted to connect sooner. The first call was from Harbridge, specifically from the CEO of Harbridge, a man named Donald Reeves who had been calling me directly for 4 years and who had, 3 months before my departure, told Gerald Fitch in a quarterly review meeting that I was the reason Harbridge had not gone to market with a competing firm. I know he said this because Gerald had repeated it to me as a compliment and because Donald had confirmed it when I asked him directly in a conversation I had initiated 6 weeks before I resigned, during which I had told him nothing specific but had asked him a question that professionals in my position sometimes ask their most trusted client relationship. I had asked Donald whether, hypothetically, his firm's consulting needs were tied to the institution or to the individual doing the work. Donald had looked at me for a moment. Then he had said, "Claire, we hired Harlow Meridian to get you. If you were somewhere else, the question answers itself." I had thanked him for his time and gone back to my desk and added a note to the business plan. Donald called at 2 in the afternoon on Monday and said he was looking at my email and that the question he had answered hypothetically 6 weeks ago appeared to no longer be hypothetical. I said that was correct. He said he needed to talk to his board but that he expected the conversation would be brief. He called back on Wednesday. Harbridge signed with Weston Strategy Group the following Monday. The second client to call was a healthcare distribution company I had brought into Harlow Meridian in my 5th year, a regional operator called Fairview Medical Supply whose CFO had told me once, with the frankness that CFOs sometimes deploy when they feel safe, that the quality of the work they received was entirely dependent on my involvement and that any change in that involvement would prompt a conversation about their relationship with the firm. Fairview called on Tuesday. They signed on Thursday. I want to be honest about something here because I think people sometimes hear stories like this and imagine that the clients were doing me a favor. They were not. They were making a business decision. They had a consulting relationship that worked, that produced results they could point to, and they were following that relationship to wherever it produced those results. The fact that it happened to be my new firm was consequential to me. It was logical to them. That is the thing about doing the work well over a long period of time. You do not accumulate loyalty. You accumulate a track record. And a track record does not belong to the institution. It belongs to the person who built it. By the end of the first month, Weston Strategy Group had 3 signed clients and a 4th in conversation. The revenue from those 3 clients, annualized, exceeded my salary at Harlow Meridian by a margin that I will not specify because some numbers are better kept quiet. What I will say is that it was enough to hire 1 full-time analyst, which I did in week 6, and to begin the process of formalizing the firm's structure in a way that was built for growth rather than for getting through the next quarter. I had also, by the end of the first month, heard from Gerald Fitch, not directly, through a mutual mutual contact in the industry, a woman named Priya who ran a boutique research firm and who had worked with both of us at different times and who called me not to relay a message from Gerald but to tell me, with the particular discomfort of someone who is delivering information they find distasteful, that Gerald had been making statements in the market about the circumstances of my departure. The statements were not accurate. They implied a performance issue. They implied that the departure had been the firm's decision rather than mine. They implied, in the specific language of someone who has been briefed by legal counsel to avoid saying anything actionable, that Weston Strategy Group's early client wins reflected relationships that Harlow Meridian considered proprietary. I called Rita. She said, "Send me everything." I sent her everything. The performance reviews. The email chain in which Gerald had described my Harbridge work as the reason for the firm's relationship strength. The Ventris pitch documentation. The exit agreement in which Harlow Meridian had waived the non-compete and released all claims in exchange for my silence on the constructive dismissal grounds. Rita read it over a weekend. She called me on Monday morning and said, "He is making statements that are inconsistent with a legal agreement his firm signed. That is not a complicated situation." She sent a letter. Gerald stopped making statements. I want to say something about Marcus Webb because I think the story wants him to be the villain and he is not exactly that either. Marcus was a beneficiary of a system that rewarded certain things and overlooked others. He was not the architect of that system. He used what was available to him in the way that people use what is available to them, and the availability of my work and my frameworks and my methodologies was something I had created by being generous with knowledge in a room that was not designed to reward that generosity. I do not think about Marcus very much. I thought about him intensely for about 6 weeks after I left, and then the work of building my own firm gave me something much more interesting to think about. What I do think about, when I think about that period at all, is the conversation I had with Sandra Park before she left the firm. The one where I raised what I was observing and she said she would keep an eye on it. Sandra had known. She had seen the shape of it clearly, and she had been navigating her own constraints in a system that was also not designed to reward her generosity, and she had left before she could do anything about what she had seen. I found Sandra 2 years after I opened Weston Strategy Group. She had built something of her own, a smaller operation focused on organizational strategy, and we had coffee on a Thursday afternoon and talked for 3 hours about the specific experience of being very good at work in rooms that were not built for people like us. I offered her a partnership. She said she needed to think about it. She called me 4 days later and said yes. Sandra Park is now a managing partner at Weston Strategy Group. She is the best decision I made in year 3. The Ventris Group situation resolved itself in the way that situations like it tend to resolve, which is slowly and without drama and in the direction that the work had always pointed. Harlow Meridian ran the Ventris account for 14 months with Marcus as lead partner. In month 15, Ventris Group's CFO, a woman named Helen Chow who had been in the room for the original pitch and had asked me 3 of the 4 most incisive questions in that meeting, reached out through a mutual contact to ask whether Weston Strategy Group was in a position to take on a significant new engagement. I said yes. Helen and I met for lunch. She described the situation. It was a complex operational strategy engagement, the kind that required exactly the depth of sector knowledge I had spent 7 years building. She said Ventris had been working with another firm and that the relationship was not producing what they needed. She did not say the firm's name. She did not need to. We started work on the Ventris engagement 8 weeks later. I will not tell you the revenue figure because that is Ventris's business. I will tell you that the engagement became one of Weston Strategy Group's anchor relationships and that Helen Chow has referred us to 3 additional companies in the healthcare distribution sector in the 2 years since. Gerald Fitch retired from Harlow Meridian 18 months after I left. I do not know the circumstances. I heard about it the way you hear about things in a small industry, secondhand, with a brevity that told me the departure was not on his preferred terms. Harlow Meridian still exists. It is smaller than it was. Several of its strongest analysts have left in the years since I did, some to other firms, 2 to Weston Strategy Group, 1 to start her own practice. These things are not consequences I engineered. They are consequences of a culture that optimized for the wrong things for long enough that the people who did the work found somewhere else to do it. I do not celebrate that. It is not a celebration. It is just what happens when you take care of the people who take care of the work and what happens when you do not. Weston Strategy Group has 12 full-time staff now, a research team, 3 senior analysts, Sandra and me as managing partners, and an operations manager named Julia who runs the internal systems with a precision that makes everything else possible. We have 18 active client relationships. Our revenue has grown every year since we opened. I do not tell you those numbers to impress you. I tell you them because they are the answer to the question Gerald Fitch's expression was asking in that conference room when he slid the folder across the table and told me that Marcus Webb had been promoted. The question his expression was asking was, what are you going to do about it? The answer was this. All of this. The 4 days and the exit agreement and the Monday morning announcement and the phone calls and the signed clients and the firm that that grew from a business plan on a personal laptop in the evenings of my 6th year into something that employs 12 people and serves 18 clients and has Sandra Park as a managing partner. That is what I did about it. I have been asked many times since I opened Weston Strategy Group what advice I would give to someone in the position I was in before I left. Someone who is doing the work, building the relationship, generating the result, and watching those results be attributed to a room that does not include them. Here is what I say: document everything. Not because you are planning to use it, but because the habit of documentation is the habit of clarity. When you write down what you did and when you did it and what it produced, you understand your own contribution in a way that the room sometimes does not. And understanding your own contribution is the foundation of everything that comes after. Know your contract. Not because you are planning to leave, but because you cannot make a fully informed decision about your situation without understanding the legal parameters of it. The 3 things Rita identified in my contract were there for years before I found them. The information was available. I just had not looked. And build for the next chapter while you are still in this one. Not as a betrayal of where you are, as a recognition that where you are is not where you are going. The business plan I wrote in the evenings of my 6th year was not an act of disloyalty to Harlow Meridian. It was an act of honesty about what I was capable of and where that capability was and was not being used. You are allowed to know your worth before someone else decides to recognize it. You are allowed to build toward a room where your work carries your name. You are allowed to quit on a Friday and open on a Monday. The work was always mine. I just needed a place that was mine to put it. That is my story. One folder slid across a table, 4 days of quiet preparation, and a Monday morning that changed every morning after it. If this stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the work you build belongs to you, regardless of whose name is on the door. Drop a comment and tell me about a moment you finally bet on yourself. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.